Today you'll meet Carla Austin, a family therapist who's here to talk to us about the horrifying effects of child abuse. In a few minutes, Carla will tell us how people overcome not only child abuse, but deal with the effects of abuse.
Welcome to Hope for Life's Journey.
Hello, I'm Randy Beckton, and welcome to Hope for Life's Journey, a special presentation of the Herald of Truth Ministries. Today, we're talking about a problem that has existed for centuries, yet it's only begun to be fully publicized in recent years. It's a problem that wounds each one of us emotionally whenever we hear about it, and yet our efforts at stopping it seem to be very frustrated. The problem? Child abuse. Over 1.5 million cases are confirmed every year of child abuse. Those are just the ones that are confirmed. Many more occur. As many as 2,000 children each year lose their lives because of child abuse. 18,000 permanently disabled. 142,000 are seriously injured. Now, these figures say nothing of the deep emotional scars that remain when someone you've trusted to protect and care for you gives pain. But there is hope. Stay with us. Now, to set the stage for our discussion of this nightmare of child abuse, I want to show you some clips from a class taught by Dr. Glenn Owen. The subject of the class was Child Abuse, the Unspeakable Sin. Let's take a look.
Marlene and I have 3 children, and we have 3 grandchildren. And frankly, when I begin to think about child abuse, I get bordering on non-Christian. It really makes me angry, like I know it does you. I just cannot believe that people would treat children that way. You remember just not too long ago, there was some things on television about child abuse. One particular case in Chicago where they killed this mother and extracted the child and killed the 2 children. I got so angry I couldn't watch it. I just quit. And the reason I don't like to talk about it is because it makes me want to say words that I promised God years ago I would never say again. And it makes me want to do things that I promised God that I wouldn't do. But it's really, really important that we consider child abuse. Number one, it's a biblical subject because Jesus himself talked about it a lot. And number 2, maybe we can help somebody and avoid that as we look at them and look at their lives as we go through it. Children are God's gift. There's a passage in Psalms that I just love. It's in 127, beginning in verse 3, and says it like this. Sons are a heritage from the Lord. Children, a reward from him. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior are sons born in one's youth. Children are a blessing. Marlene and I did not know, and she's a childhood sweetheart. I started dating her when I was in the 9th grade, and she was in the 8th grade. But we didn't know happiness until our children came, and we are so blessed by them. I told her the other day, Marlene, you know the sin that we commit the most? And her eyes got big, you know, because she is as perfect a woman as I know. She said, what? I said, we don't give thanks enough to God for our children. And so when I think about my children and think about child abuse, I just can't believe that people would mistreat a child. And I think it is one of the most heinous, wretched sins that anybody can commit. Having children is such a blessing. You remember in the New Testament when Elizabeth became pregnant with John the Baptist, she said that her curse had been taken away because childlessness in those days was considered a curse. So children are yes, a blessing. As a matter of fact, one of the great things about children is they exemplify God's relationship with us. In 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, the word children comes up 19 times in those 3 little short books because God's talking about his relationship to us. And on top of that, there's a beautiful Jewish proverb. I love this one. Think about it. Remember when you are to be judged before the Holy One, that the judge is also your Father. Because John says in 1 John 3:1, behold, what love God has lavished on us, that we should be called children of God. So children are to be protected. Jesus spoke a lot about children. We're not going to go into all the passages. We don't have time. But he talked a lot about children. In Matthew 18, in verse 14, he talks about those who would abuse children. And he basically said, children are God's representatives on earth. They're kind of the bridge to heaven. Because of their innocence, because of their trust, because of their dependence, because of their joy. Have you ever seen anything sweeter than a little girl who's just giggly over getting a new doll? I haven't. It's just fantastic. And because of their spontaneity, they're not trying to impress anybody. They're just kids. And Jesus said, you know what? That's what the kingdom of heaven is like. Children are most like Jesus, the first citizen of heaven. So that's why I am so important that they be with him. And he emphatically used children to teach a lot of different things. There is a passage in Matthew 18:6 where Jesus very, very strongly condemns child abuse. It's just incredible. He said it like this. He said, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? They're having an argument over who's the big wheel in their group. And here's what Jesus answers them. He said, he called a little child and had him stand among them, and he said, I tell you the truth, unless you change and become like a little child, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And therefore, whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And here's the one that really clinches it. And whoever welcomes a little child like this in my name welcomes me. So children are very, very specially important to Jesus. And there are all kinds of things that he really condemns child abuse. He says it like this. If you abuse a child, whoever brings harm to a child, well, let me just read the passage better than me trying to quote it. He said, if anyone causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble or to sin, it would be better for him to have a large millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. This millstone he's talking about is what they ground wheat on. And you put the wheat on it, and it was so big that a mule had to pull it. And he said, you hurt a child? What needs to happen to you is put one of these millstones that it's so big a mule has to pull it around your neck and dump you in the water. In other words, Jesus is saying, you don't harm children. Well, it goes on all the time. I had hundreds of statistics I could have given, but the more I read them, frankly, I'll be honest with you, I teach this with a little bit of anger, you know, and you can tell that I'm really get bent out of shape on this. But there's something better than that. Let's look at what the types of abuse, and let's see what we can do to help people with it. And it may be that we are unconsciously doing some abuse. I have abused my children, and now don't draw any conclusions till I tell you how in just a minute. There are a lot of different kinds of abuse, they tell us. Number one, the abuse in physical needs. I've known fathers, I've known mothers who spent most or all of the money they had on themselves, and there wasn't enough left for the children. I laughingly the other day got to counting the number of cars I've owned, and I'm 41 years old with 59 years experience. So I'm doing all this with the cars, and you know, maybe I couldn't even remember some of the cars I had, that at the time I had them were so important that I just had to have them, but couldn't even remember them. Couldn't remember if they were stick shift or whatever, but I'd spent the money on them. And I know a lot of parents who spend money on clothes or cars or TVs or movies or whatever, and their children don't have enough. That's abuse, physical abuse. But there's also one called spiritual abuse. Now, we normally think about sexual and physical, and we'll get to that in just a second. But to not teach your child about God is spiritual abuse. Now, they're not going to come and arrest you for it, but God will call us into question for it, I guarantee you. It was interesting, I got to reading in the book of Proverbs and finally decided that what Proverbs really is advice to parents on how to rear children. You go back and read it like that. Did you know the term son or my son occurs 42 different times in the book of Proverbs? You read it. It's really interesting. But there's hope for this. And if we will read God's Word and use other resources that are available to us, we can help others. Not only ourselves, do better with our children and grandchildren, but also with others. You know, not teaching a child about God is spiritual child abuse. We steal their innocence when we don't teach them about God. I read something also the other day, said, a candle only gives light when it goes before you, not when it's behind you. What's he saying? He's saying, dads, moms, get out in front of the children. Be the example. You shine the light so they can see where they're going when they come along behind you. If we don't educate our children, then we're giving them what I call educational abuse. The Jews have a saying, if you do not teach your child a trade, you make him or her a thief. And so we need to teach our children to function in the community and as citizens in the kingdom of God. Then there's physical abuse. This is one I don't like to talk about. Parents are to protect their children. They're not to hurt them. And so all discipline, and there should be discipline, has to be measured, and I like this play on words, prayerful and careful. We're to discipline, yes, but it should not get out of line, because the parent's arms should be the most secure refuge in the world for a child. Being held by mom or being held by dad is where nothing is going to hurt you. But there's sexual abuse. This is, I believe, God's greatest revulsion. Like I say, I don't even like to talk about it. It makes me think bad thoughts. There's emotional abuse. Not showing love, not showing affection. And this is the one that a lot of parents commit. I have personal, intimate knowledge of a young lady that when her father came to see this young lady's child, and the child ran up to the father and said, "I love you," the father said, "I love you too." It was the first time this daughter had ever heard her father say, "I love you." Now that is criminal. It's wrong. Love is a child's #1 birthright. They have more right to that than any shirt, any TV game, any video game. They need love. We need to express it. Hugs and kisses and pats and all kinds of stuff in the right kind of way. Well, here's the one that I'm guilty of. Relationship and time. You know, one of the most damning things that hit me in the head one time? We were sitting around. My children are grown. We're sitting around, and somebody says, "What do you remember most about your dad?" And one of my sons said that he was gone all the time. Don't do that. And those of you that are viewing, don't do that. I'm reading a lot of Jewish literature now because it's so beautiful, but listen to this right here. The Holy One's favorite place is in the human heart. I changed a word and put it like this. The Holy One's favorite place is in a child's heart. Now let's do it right here, quickly. What is a child? A child is innocence, meeting the world with a trusting, outstretched hand. Curiosity, discovering the world, unhurriedly, unplanned. Honesty, laying bare the world's joys and hidden flaws. Excitement, never allowing the world to stop but briefly pause. A child is laughter, conquering the world with an open, smiling face. A child is love, uplifting the world to a happier, higher place. A child is God's preview of heaven. Jesus said, "Whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me. And who welcomes me does not welcome me, but welcomes the one who sent me." Children, God's gift.
Our guest today is Carla Austin. Welcome, Carla. You've been a therapist for 9 years. I know that you have seen child abuse. Tell me about some of the cases that you've dealt with.
Randy, I've seen child abuse in many, many cases. I've seen infants who were abused, shaken too hard, left in the bitter cold to be abandoned, left with brain damage. I've seen 1-year-olds abused to the point of intercourse with sexual abuse.
Oh, my.
I've seen many, many young children exposed to the conflict of their parents, marital disputes, and brought into those disputes, taken hostage, afraid that one parent might leave, and making sure that they don't get the children. Certainly older children who leave home because things are so bad in their home.
Now, every time I'm hearing you describe something, I'm wondering, where is the hope?
Well, Randy, the hope, the true hope, is a long way away, is our hope in heaven. Here on this earth, it's always going to be difficult. Any trials that we've been through, and certainly backgrounds of abuse, the recovery is a very long process, and nothing makes it just automatically better.
Some of them come to you, though, because they believe that they can change, and they're looking for the power to change, right?
Certainly.
And so, is it a quick process, or does it take a long time?
Recovery is a very long-term process. And in counseling, not only do we deal with the issues from their past, the abuse that they've experienced, but we deal with the consequences of that abuse.
Now let me ask you this question. When you see someone and you know that there's an abuse in the situation, what are the first steps that you take?
First steps would include helping those people to utilize their resources, their support system, activating any support they might have through Christian friends or family members, through support groups, therapy situations, anything like that. Then accessing their own personal resources, their own strengths, focusing on the positives and things they have going for them.
Now in our audience today is Dr. Glenn Owen. That's not the Dr. Glenn Owen who has spoken today on the program, but his son, who is a medical doctor who works in the ER, the emergency room. Dr. Owen, welcome. I want to ask you a question. Do you see this too?
Unfortunately, I do. You know, Randy, of all the ugly things we see in the emergency department, the violence and accidents and so forth, there's nothing uglier than intentional physical harm to a child.
So you see small children who are brought into the hospital. Are you told the true story, or are you lied to? What happens?
Usually lied to. You know, actually, probably a lot of the times we don't see it, we don't pick it up, because the children are afraid. They've been coached, and they're afraid of what might happen if they might lose a parent. But there are times when it is obvious, and those are the times when we certainly act.
Now, you're trained and you know what you're looking at, but before we go to the broader audience for questions, what would we see that would tell us that there's child abuse?
First of all, any type of injury that doesn't fit the story, like a very young child rolled off the bed and broke a leg, a child too young to even roll over.
So a 1 month, 2 month old that can't roll over, and
exactly.
That story's a little suspicious.
Exactly. Or different types or patterns of injuries. You know, a 5-year-old with bruised shins is normal, but with bruises on the buttocks, the back, the ears, that would not be normal. Bruises in the shapes of objects, like a ring whelp from a whip cord, or various objects like a buckle, would leave scars and bruises of distinctive shapes.
All right, what's the first thing you do as a doctor? After you've looked them over, do you check them in the hospital? Do you send them home? Do you call someone?
First priority is to protect the child, and usually that means admitting them to the hospital, getting Department of Protective Services involved, and the police often involved right away.
All right. Well, some of you have questions. Let me hear from you. All right?
Do you think it's abusive for parents to be permissive, anything goes with their kids?
All right. Carla, we'll ask you to answer that. Does that contribute to this climate?
Certainly it does. It demonstrates a lack of clear boundaries. It's not making a clear statement about a child's ability to say, here's where I stop and you start. Situations like that, I've seen, 10, 11-year-old little girls that still shower with their fathers, and that's the anything goes approach.
Oh, my. Oh, my. All right, another question. Yes.
A question for Carla. Why has this situation of child abuse grown so rapidly in our country today? And is we see so much publicity on it every day in the news media and on TV. Is it really worse?
Okay. I think partly that is because our awareness of the problem is so much greater. Certainly it is worse, I believe. That's because our family system is broken down and we no longer have the strength in the family unit that we once had. We don't live in close proximity to our extended family and have that support system. And the stress is greater. Most perpetrators abuse because they're unable to handle the stress that goes on in their lives. Certainly stress is greater now than it used to be.
Carla, let me ask you, what happens to small children when they're in an abusive situation and they grow up in that situation? What do they become as adults?
Okay. There's all kinds of possibilities. Many victims of abuse will struggle with depression or anxiety as an adult. Many times they will have trouble with wanting to harm themselves. They'll struggle with low self-esteem, have difficulty in interpersonal relationships. Many times they struggle with addictions, chemical dependency or other addictions. And sometimes they even become perpetrators themselves.
Can a person who has been a perpetrator be forgiven?
Certainly.
Well, but it's not a simple thing because they're learning to do this. They're continuing to do it. What's the process out of it?
I think the process out of any sin is first to recognize that we have that problem, and it's the same for perpetrators. They have to admit that they do have a problem and be willing to seek assistance for that. It's a very difficult thing. It's very resistant to therapy, but there are many people who have been perpetrators in their past who no longer are, and who are no longer great threats to society.
Now, I would suspicion that you in the audience might feel like I feel, that you want to be forgiving toward abusers, but you also want a punishment phase in this. So how do we balance, Carla? How do we balance the need to forgive, encourage, with the need to have someone face up to the responsibility of what they're doing and how horrible it is?
Okay. I think we do that by separating the sin from the sinner, or the act from the person.
Well, that's easy to say. Now, how do you do it?
Well, certainly you set clear boundaries. If you know that an individual has been a perpetrator, has been a child abuser in their past, then you set boundaries that don't allow them to be exposed to young children without supervision. We have to use our heads and do things that are smart, at the same time accepting those people with the warmth and the love that God gives us.
That's good. I want to go back to Dr. Owen for a moment. Dr. Owen, if someone today is watching this program and they're saying, I may be an abuser, I may be a perpetrator, as Carla says, what would you say to them?
I agree with Carla. The first thing they need to do is get help. They need to talk to a trusted friend, a minister, family member. There are certainly social services available to help, and they need to admit their fears, their concerns, and get some help.
Carla, you've been counseling for 9 years. What do you say that you didn't say the first year that you saw this situation? Have you learned some things that move the process toward healing along quicker than perhaps when you first started out?
Are you talking for the victim or for the perpetrator?
Let's say for the moment the victim.
Okay.
Do you jump in? Are you pretty activistic?
I think it's important that you don't take on the person's anger. You don't take that on for them. Many times the victim was abused by someone that they were close to. And if you share that anger for their father, step-parent, whatever, then they become defensive. They're no longer able to experience that anger for themselves. They have to defend. So the most important thing for a therapist, a friend, another family member being supportive is to remain neutral, supportive but neutral towards that perpetrator.
Now, there are all kinds of people calling themselves therapists. I want to ask you, how does a person find somebody that they can trust? What would you suggest?
I think it's important to ask questions when you're looking for a therapist. And certainly you can talk with a minister or a friend, a family member. But to look for a therapist, I think it's important to find a Christian therapist. You may look for someone who is licensed, someone who has had experience.
All right.
Feel free to ask about their education and how they work with people.
But take action. That's what I'm hearing you say.
Certainly.
Now, we just have 30 seconds left in our program today. I want to go for one more question to our studio audience. Who has a question they'd like to ask Carla?
Is a child abuser often someone who was abused themselves?
Certainly so. It's growing up in a dysfunctional atmosphere that can add to the stress that a perpetrator might feel that would lead them to be an abuser themselves, certainly. And part of their recovery is going to focus on recovering from their own abuse as well as their desire to abuse.
Well, we haven't begun to touch the hem of the garment, but perhaps you've heard in what has been said that we believe there's hope if we'll face the truth and if we'll start taking those steps. If you've ever doubted that evil was alive and well in America, this terrible truth about child abuse certainly proves it, doesn't it? I know that many of our listeners have had experience with this terror. You may be struggling in the middle of the problem right now in your own extended family. If you'd like help, I'd be happy to hear from you. If there's one thing that's obvious in all of this, it's that we really need God. We need a constant connection with the Creator and His Son, Jesus Christ, in order to know how we should behave toward our children. On the other hand, someone viewing may be trying to cope as an adult with abuse that happened to you as a child. Maybe you've tried overcoming that all by yourself, but you found out you needed more help. I can tell you that only God the Father does the deep emotional surgery that's required to heal our scars. Our Creator, your Heavenly Father, is waiting with open arms. He's eager to make you a new creature in Him. These programs are made possible through the donations of members of Churches of Christ around the world. We pay for these broadcasts because Jesus Christ is changing our lives, and we want to share that wonderful opportunity with you. So write us or give us a call and let us know how we can be of help to you. We're looking forward to hearing from you and to seeing you next time on Hope for Life's Journey, brought to you by the Herald of Truth Ministries.